Our next speaker is a native Texan. He's an Eagle Scout and attended Trinity University in San Antonio, where he graduated cum laude with a bachelor's degree in English and philosophy. He earned his Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Texas Law School. He was president of the Environmental Law Society and editor of the Texas Environmental Law Journal. He also served on the University Texas Environmental Law Clinic, where he conducted research for Clean Air Act citizen suits against a Houston chemical plant. That suit resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement. During and after law school, our speaker interned for Save Our Springs Alliance in Austin, Texas, the Environmental and Natural Resources Division of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and Air Alliance Houston. He is a two-time recipient of the Texas Legal Fellowship, a recipient of the Joe and Teresa Long Legal Fellowship, and a recipient of the University Co-op Public Interest Awards for graduating students. He has served as the environmental director and counsel for State Representative Jessica Farrar during the 82nd session of the Texas Legislature. He has worked in the field of Clean Air Act legislation for several groups, including the Environmental Integrity Project. In 2010, he completed a legal fellowship with Air Alliance Houston, conducting research on flexible air permits at several Texas refineries. He joined Air Alliance permanently in 2012 as a community outreach coordinator and now serves as the executive director for Air Alliance. It is with great pride that I introduce my son, Adrian Shelley.
Thanks, Dad. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for being here in the room and for being with us online. I appreciate it. I don't always get introduced by my father, but it sure is an honor. So thanks for being here, and thank you all. So yeah, I am the director of Air Alliance Houston. We are an air quality and public health organization that works out of Houston, Texas. And we've been involved in this effort for more than 25 years. So I think you should all have a handout. Have they gotten the handouts? You should. There you go. It's got a cell phone on the front and it's got a big black smoky cloud on the back, right? And the cell phone on the front is going to alert us to the big black smoky cloud on the back. What this handout is about is House Bill 1927 by Eddie Rodriguez out of San Antonio. And what it will do is create a modern, we're calling it an Amber Alert style notification, a text message notification for hazardous chemical releases and emergencies. There is already a statute to alert state lawmakers in the event of a release that poses a substantial threat to human health or the environment. That statute hasn't been updated since, I believe, 1981. So it's fairly out of date. And all it actually requires is that the State Emergency Response Commission, notify elected officials in the event of a hazardous release. There are better ways to do these notifications today. We are all getting now Amber Alert notifications on our cell phones. We get, depending on what part of the state you live in, you might get flood notifications like I get in Houston a lot of the time. You might get forest fire notifications if you live in Central or West Texas. But we are familiar with these so-called push notifications that we get on our phones now, right? They are automatically on your phone. You have to opt out of those systems, right? You receive those notifications unless you opt out. That's very different than the way our hazardous chemical notification systems work in the state. All of the notification systems that we currently have are at the city or local municipality level. So there are groups called LEPCs, Local Emergency Planning Commissions. They are, in some cases, tasked with getting these notifications out. There are also offices of emergency management at some cities that are tasked with getting out some kind of message. And depending on the jurisdiction, their resources, how big they are, how often they face these kinds of threats, they have all different kinds of notification systems right now. Some of them have an email-based system, or maybe an opt-in text message system. Some of the plants have sirens and loudspeakers, right? So they just whoop, whoop, siren, and then some sort of garbled message comes out that you can't really understand, right? Some of them just rely on the local media. So something comes out on TV or on the radio, something like that, right? It's a patchwork system. And again, some jurisdictions have better systems than others. So what House Bill 1927 does is it authorizes the state to create a single modernized system that would push notifications to your cell phone. And they'd be a little bit more sophisticated than the average system that we see today. They can be a little bit longer than other notifications, and they can also contain live links. And the idea here is that the notification drives you to a link that contains information about what happened, right? What is the chemical that's in the air? What are the dangers that it poses? What health effects might I experience if I'm exposed to this chemical? Which direction is it moving? Which direction is the wind moving? Who's likely to be impacted? And a nice thing about these push notifications, they can be geo-targeted, right? So they can be targeted directly at a particular jurisdiction where an incident is happening. And the bill also directs the state emergency response commission to do this in a cross-media way. So to use social media, to use the state's website, to use all of the resources that are available to get notifications out as soon as possible. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of recent incidents that might have gone differently if this system was in place. If you look at the back of my handout, you'll see incidents from Houston in 2016. Now, this is just Houston, it's just 2016, and it is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just some of the highlights. We have one of these incidents about every 6 weeks in Houston. So a couple of the ones I'm going to tell you about now happened in Houston. First, fire in Spring Branch at a chemical warehouse right next to Spring Branch Elementary School. In that case, they didn't know what was in that chemical warehouse. They didn't know what was burning. They didn't know what the risk was. The firemen didn't know what they were fighting. It was an elementary school right next door. They initially issued a shelter-in-place order. About 45 minutes later, they changed it to an evacuation order. So by the time you had about 600 students and administrators coming out of the school, loading into buses, going off-site, you had all these camera crews out there. You had all these reporters breathlessly reporting what was going on. It was a big mess, right? And the fact that it took 45 minutes for that evacuation order to get issued was part of the problem there. Next, there was, and this is a smaller incident, but it is listed on the sheet here. There was a shelter-in-place order issued in Baytown. Now, shelter-in-place means stay where you are, right? If you're at home, if you're in a business, if you're at school, stay where you are. Schools during shelter-in-places have to bring their people into interior rooms. If they're able to, they have to seal up doors and windows with tape. It's a pretty serious order, a shelter-in-place. It was a pipeline leak in Baytown that led to a shelter-in-place order in a neighborhood. People who were signed up for the email notification got a notice of the shelter-in-place. They never got a notice that the shelter-in-place was lifted. So the people in Baytown sat in their homes for hours and hours and hours waiting for that shelter-in-place order to get lifted. They eventually heard about it being lifted on the news. There was no follow-up to the email that was sent. It's a very distressful situation for those folks sitting at home for hours at a time with no further instructions. And then finally, this is not one that occurred in Houston, but certainly one of the most high-profile chemical accidents in the last couple of years, and that was the explosion and fire in West Texas. It was a fertilizer plant that caught fire. Now, 15 people were killed in that explosion and fire. Many of them were first responders whose jobs it was to put their lives on the line to get out there and fight that fire and keep people safe, right? But many of the people who passed away were citizens. They were neighbors, they were residents of the area who didn't know what was going on and came outside to look, right? They were curious, maybe they were a little concerned, they didn't know. They came outside and they actually gathered around the fire. And then the explosion happened, right? and many people were killed simply because they didn't know what was going on. So if we had a system in place like House Bill 1927, those people would have been notified early on. This is a dangerous situation. Stay away. So that's House Bill 1927. It's been filed by Eddie Rodriguez in the House. He's out of San Antonio. Hubert Vo out of Houston has signed on as a co-author. We expect Jessica Farrar out of Houston to sign on as a co-author. We are looking at some Senate sponsors right now, and we're also hoping to find some Republican sponsors in the House, because of course we need some good Republican support to take this bill anywhere. Everybody that we talk to about this issue understands that it needs to happen, right? And the easiest way, if you are going out to your members' offices today, tomorrow, whenever, easiest way to describe this to them is to take out your phone and say, it's just like those Amber Alert notifications that you get in the middle of the night or whatever, all right? It's very simple. Statute hadn't been updated since the 80s. It's time for a new system, all right? So that's the one issue I wanted to bring up, and I really want to encourage you to work on today and after today. I have one other thing I'm going to mention briefly, but does anybody have any questions about this issue, this bill, or strategy in bringing this bill to your elected officials? Yes, sir, in the back. Good question. Is the bill expensive? We don't have a fiscal note for the bill yet. It is going to have a fiscal note. We do not know exactly what it'll be. Fiscal notes are a big problem this session, as they often are, right? So that is going to be an issue. Our typical answer to this, right, is that in many local jurisdictions, there are systems in place. And if the local system is better or more sophisticated, then they don't have to buy into the state system. There are other areas where this doesn't exist and we need it. And at this point, the most efficient way to do it is to just get the state to create the next best system. So it will have a fiscal note, but in the long run, it will promote efficiency in this process. In the front.
I think we got the same one from online, and you did an outstanding job repeating the question. So if you could do that again.
Certainly.
Are there any other states that have a law like this?
Okay, so the question was, other states with a similar law. I do not know about other individual states. I can tell you at the federal level, FEMA has a very good system for this. And in fact, in some ways, the bill that has been written is modeled after some of what FEMA has done. We're not really making that explicit as we advocate for this bill or in our fact sheet or any of that, just because there's no real need to point in Texas to what the federal government is doing, right? But there is a better system that FEMA created. I know that there are states who have just adopted the FEMA system wholesale. I honestly don't know what states those are, or whether there are other states who have initiated their own more modern systems. But thank you for the question. I think we had one in front here, and then we'll get back there. Did you have a question? Yeah? Oh, same question. Great. All right, so back here. Okay, so the question was, who is the Healthy Port Communities Coalition? And I appreciate that question because I didn't get a chance to plug the coalition. That is a group that was formed back in 2012, I believe, when the Port of Houston Authority was undergoing sunset review at the state legislature, which happened in 2013. It's a coalition of community organizations that advocates for the health and safety of communities around the Houston Ship Channel. So Air Alliance Houston, my organization, was a founding member. TAHAS out of Houston, the Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, is a founding member. A group called COCO, the Coalition of Community Organizations, which works out of the near North Side and Greater Fifth Ward area in Houston. Also, some partners that you might know from here in Austin. Public Citizen is a founding member and actually the leader of the coalition, and also the Environmental Defense Fund here out of Austin. So that coalition has been active for about 4 to 5 years on issues that affect the safety and the health of people in the ship channel. And if I can just say a word about LaPorte, I'm sure you remember the DuPont accident in, I believe it was November of 2014. There was a release of methylmercaptan. Methylmercaptan is the chemical that makes natural gas smell. It is very odorous. The leak was smelled 40 miles away. There were people who were calling the city of Houston very concerned from 40 miles away. Now, very close up, there was enough methylmercaptan inside the facility to be fatal for several workers, right? Outside of the facility, and as you got further away, the risk dissipated, but people simply didn't know that, right? Other questions? Sir.
Didn't something just happen in Refinery not long ago?
Yes, sir, I heard about that. The question was, something happened in Refugio just the last couple of days. I believe there was a refinery explosion. Yeah, within the last day or two. I'm afraid I don't know a whole lot of details. You know, refinery explosions are very common, and some of them lead to maybe a local shelter in place, a local evacuation, and I mean on site. Some of them lead to actions that the community has to take. Roads getting shut down, shelter in place orders. Anytime you get a nice big black cloud of smoke or something that smells real bad, you're gonna get a lot of concerned people calling in to the local city, county, whatever, because they just don't know, all right? There's one other issue I want to bring up, but do we have other questions about the toxic alerts issue? Okay, so again, if you're interested in pushing this to your elected officials, I always just use the visual aid, right? That's why it's on the handout. It's just like an Amber Alert that you would get if we do it for a flood, if we do it for a fire. It makes perfect sense to do it for hazardous chemical release, right? So the other issue, and I left this to the last because it kind of supervenes a lot of the work that we do and will probably be very similar for you all because it concerns the budget, and specifically a large appropriation within the budget for a program called the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan, or TARP. Does anybody know what the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan is, just by show of hands? Okay, great, a couple of people. Very quickly, what this is it is a pot of money that we use to reduce air pollution from mobile sources. Mobile sources meaning trucks, cars, trains, marine vessels, those sorts of things. It is an incredibly cost-effective program. It is one of the cheapest ways to remove some of the really bad pollutants, things like nitrogen oxides, which lead to ozone pollution. Is anybody familiar with the fact that we now have twice as many areas in Texas that don't meet the ozone standard as we used to? What cities used to not meet the ozone standard? Anybody know? I'll be real impressed. Houston and Dallas. Easy enough, right? 2 more cities have been added. They are Austin and San Antonio, right? So especially if you are working Austin and San Antonio, you guys are now in non-attainment of that ozone standard. And funding TARP, the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan, is one of the best things that we can do to reduce the pollution that causes ozone. You guys, all of you as individuals, if you own a car, are paying into TARP. $200 million every year, Texans are paying into this fund. And we want to see all $200 million spent every year on efforts to reduce air pollution from our cars and our trucks and our trains and all of that stuff. We don't get that full appropriation. Right now, we're looking at about $118 million a year in the House budget, and we're looking at about $104 million a year in the Senate budget. We would like to spend that entire $200 million to reduce air pollution in these busy areas. It is the most cost-effective way to do it. Most lawmakers that know about TARP understand that. The reason we don't appropriate the full amount is that we want to leave the rest of the balance to balance our budget. We have a balanced budget amendment in Texas, right? And in fact, right now, there's about $1.2 billion with a B sitting in that TARP fund because we aren't appropriating the full amount, right? Sometimes when legislators hear about that, 1.2 billion with a B. When a legislator who doesn't know anything about these programs hears about this $1.2 billion fund, they start to get ideas, right? Ways to spend that money. One of the really popular ideas is to raid that for transportation funding. Why? Because if you build more roads, you alleviate congestion, right? And congestion makes air quality bad, right? No, you can't build your way out of congestion. Traffic studies for decades have proved that you can't build your way out of congestion. Look at LA, right? So we cannot use that money for transportation funding. It needs to be used to get dirty vehicles off of the air or off of the roads, right? So that's TARP, the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan. And if you are looking at the budget, if you are talking to your elected officials about needs in the budget, full funding for TARP is extremely important. And that is always, for us, our biggest issue every session, because it has the potential to make the most positive impact on air quality and public health in Texas. I saw a question. Yes. Yes, okay, so the question was, or the comment was, we really need some programs out there to educate people about the existence of TARP. There's a lot of people who just don't know that it's out there. You're right, and let me explain how that's done. First of all, it's not just TARP. There's another program called LIRAP, the Low Income Vehicle Repair and Assistance Program. And when you're talking about individuals, as opposed to like commercial fleet owners, right? Or truck drivers who own their own truck and therefore are essentially their own small business, those guys get money from TARP. Low-income citizens who are driving around residential vehicles, right? Those folks get money from LIRAP, the Low-Income Vehicle Repair and Assistance Program. It's the same story as TARP. LIRAP needs to be fully funded as well. Now, as to the question of how do we educate people about the existence of TARP and LIRAP, this is as important as ever. TARP has been around for about 15, 16 years. All of the really big, savvy fleet managers have already taken advantage of that funding, right? They knew it was out there. They had the resources to go through the administrative process. They've turned over all of their old trucks, right? So who's left is the folks who don't have the resources to go through the administrative process, or, as you said, individuals who don't know about the existence of the LIRAP program. And the way to fix that, there are always tweaks to the TARP statute and the LIRAP statute every session. There is one big bill that's called the tune-up bill that goes through every session. In this case, it's SB 26 by Senator Estes. There are some other ones out there. I believe there's a kind of a placeholder bill. If 26 doesn't get passed, there's another bill to just reauthorize TARP for a little while. But as it stands, and there's a couple of other kind of little this and that TARP bills, as it stands, SB 26 is the big omnibus TARP tune-up bill. And that bill does contain funding for outreach, education about the program, that sort of thing. I agree that we need more funding in that area, and getting that into SB 26 is the right way to make that happen. The issue with TARP, it is so old. There have been so many tune-ups over the years. It's starting to get to be a bit of a vehicle for special interests, particularly natural gas. There's more and more funding for natural gas projects in TARP. And hey, natural gas is better than coal, all right? It's better than really old, dirty diesel engines. But TARP wasn't really meant to be a vehicle to promote natural gas production, right? They don't need our help. So getting some of those special interest issues out of the TARP tune-up bills and getting some funding for outreach, for education. There's already some ideas in there to relieve some of the administrative burdens of applying, which would help those smaller guys. Those are great little fixes. If you want to dig in a little deeper on TARP, it's a very complex issue, but take a look at SB 26, see what's going on in there, and that would give you some ideas. Thank you. Other questions in the room or on the online?
Seriously, a budget item.
Yes.
So in
Yeah, okay, so the question was, is the full line item for TARP always spent? And the answer is sometimes it is not. And that is one of the reasons that are given for not increasing those appropriations year over year. I'll give you one example that I am familiar with because it's in Houston. The Houston Galveston Area Council, our local COG, has a tendency to work with the Port of Houston Authority to administer TARP funds that are used in the port. The port itself has been a little bit less willing to do its own administration of TARP funds. It wants to turn those programs over to the HGAC. And of late, in the last year or so, HGAC has started to say that it's having trouble getting all of these funds out the door, and it has actually stopped being as aggressive in applying for funding for some of these programs. There's a federal analog to TARP called DERA, the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act. HGAC didn't even apply for DERA funding last year for this reason. So there are some issues about whether we have the administrative resources to fully use those appropriations that we have. I can tell you this, there are projects out there for the money. We could appropriate the full $1.2 billion over the next biennium and find projects to spend that money. It's just a question of whether the will is there and whether the administrative resources are there. So you do sometimes hear about TARP, the low-hanging fruit is gone. We can't appropriate all of the funds. We left funds on the table. There are some jurisdictions where some of that has happened, but trust me, there is enough work to be done to justify that full $200 million of funding a year for the next biennium. Sir.
So where is SB 26?
Yeah, so the question was, where is SB 26 right now? I honestly don't know. I think it has been referred to appropriations, but has not been set for a hearing. But I'm not sure about that. So if you wanted to be strategic about, you know, who to talk to on 26, I think, like I said, I think it's in Senate Appropriations. I would confirm that and then start hitting those offices for the folks that are on appropriations.
So what is the 1.2 billion that's sitting there? What is that for? Can it be accessed to?
Yeah, so the question was, what about this $1.2 billion corpus that we hear is just sitting in the state coffers? That is called Clean Air Account 151. You don't need to remember that because it is the fund for TARP. All of it is intended to be spent on the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan, right? So it would take an act of the legislature to raid that fund for something else. There are some bills out there that would do that. For example, Huberty out of Houston has a bill to raid that account to build roads in Houston. But for the reasons I explained earlier, that's not a good idea, and that's not what that money is for. So strictly speaking, that entire $1.2 billion is to be spent on the TARP program. It's not to balance the budget, right? Are we running low on time?
Maybe one more, if anybody has one. If not,
One more question, anybody online?
we haven't hit already.
All right. Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate everybody being here. You know, some of us get paid to do this stuff and we're here all the time. We need you all behind us and with us. We need your help. It's really great to see a nice big room like this. Good luck going out there, talking to everybody. We can't do this stuff without you. So thank you.